Hello and welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival 2017. This year we asked the question, what if we could redesign everything? Coming up this show, last year in 2016, $1 in $5 under professional management in the USA were invested in sustainable, impact or responsible investing, helping innovators move beyond the idea stage. Thank you very much for joining this DIV session in week 2 of this 3-week online festival. Please remember, the DIV is an interactive festival, so we need you, our audience, to participate. Please put your questions in the chat box below this video or on Twitter using #ThinkDiv. My name is Francois. I am part of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation team. And to discuss that question about moving beyond the idea stage, joining me today are Erika Boeing and Bill Burkhart. Erika is the co-founder of Accelerate Wind, a startup that is making rooftop wind energy viable. In general, Erika focuses on solving sustainability-related problems using systems perspective. She has experience in innovating on new energy, waste or water solutions as a systems engineer. She also studied the social science associated with sustainability when she was a Fulbright researcher in the Netherlands, but she was also part of the Project Drawdown as a research fellow. Bill leads TIP, the Investment Integration Project, which helps institutional investors understand the big picture context of their portfolio level decisions. He co-wrote with Jamie Butterworth the recently released Investing in the New Industrial Revolution, which provides insights for asset managers and owners on how to finance a circular economy. It details examples of investors and corporations which are beginning to incorporate global issues in their investment, production, design processes. We'll hear Bill's perspective in a few minutes, but I am going to first ask Erika to tell us more about systems thinking in practice.
Cool, yeah. I've been passionate about systems thinking for a long time. As Francois said, it's kind of the link that connects all of the different things that I've worked on. And in general, in its most simple form, I would define systems thinking as looking for blind spots in solutions and then finding elegant ways to solve them. I imagine this festival you've heard over and over again that sustainability problems are complex and interconnected, and so just using a single discipline thinking doesn't really work, and we need to look as broad as possible. So I've done that through a combination of engineering and social science work, and I'm always kind of looking to bring in new perspectives.
Excellent. So for you, system thinking is actually looking at the same problem from a variety of different perspectives. Could you provide us with examples of such approaches?
Yeah, so I can give you 2 examples. One is probably the most concrete, what I'm doing with my business, Accelerate Wind. The other is a little bit big picture, talking about Project Drawdown, which I was also a part of. So at Accelerate Wind, as you said in the introduction, we are making rooftop wind energy economically viable. Rooftop wind turbines aren't really something that you see on roofs very often today, even though solar panels are really, really common. And the reason for that is that rooftop wind today is just prohibitively expensive. And at Accelerate Wind, we're changing that. We've identified several blind spots that we can use to make rooftop wind a lot cheaper. The first thing we realized is that we can actually work with the natural features of a building roof in order to get more power out. It turns out that at the very edge of the commercial building roofs, wind speeds are typically 1.5 to 2 times faster than other parts of the roof. And because wind power is proportional to the cube of the wind speed, that means with a 2 times faster wind speed, we can get actually an 8 times faster power, or 8 times greater wind power out of the system. And so we have a channel that captures that faster wind speed and blends into the architecture of the roof so we can get power out more economically. So that was that, using the edge of the roof, that was one blind spot that we identified. But that also wasn't quite enough. When a lot of people think about wind, they think about aerodynamics and how can we make them better to make them more efficient. And that's where we started with the edge of the roof idea. But then we, when we did an analysis of the cost profiles of rooftop wind turbines, we found out that actually the generator and the inverter are about half the cost. And so we need to reduce that cost as well. And that's something that most small wind turbine companies just don't look at. And what we figured out is that the wind turbines are generally sized for a power output that's 5 to 8 times more than their average. And they need to be, because that's when they get the highest output at that highest wind speed. But then the generators aren't being used to their full capacity all the time. And so we have an energy smoothing technology that balances this out and lets you use about a 5 times smaller generator and inverter, which reduces the cost quite a bit.
Okay, so the inverter and the generator are what actually transform that wind power into electricity inside the head of the wind turbines.
Sorry, I didn't understand your question.
I was asking, like, the inverters and the generator are actually what transforms that wind power into. Okay.
Correct. So we capture the faster wind speed, and that means we can use smaller wind turbine blades to get more power out. But then transforming the power to electricity, you still need a large generator and inverter without our energy smoothing technology.
Excellent. Yeah. And the other project you mentioned, Project Drawdown, I'd be very interested to hear more about the approach and how it worked.
Yeah, so Project Drawdown is a much bigger picture project than the specific technology we're designing with our company, but it was something that I had the opportunity to be involved with last year. And it's the brainchild of Paul Hawken, who's an environmentalist, author, and entrepreneur. And he started asking in about 2001, what would it take to reverse global warming? Do we know what solutions we would need to promote? And nobody could give him an answer. And so then he kept asking, and in 2013, Project Drawdown was born to give an answer to this. And it's a nonprofit that's a coalition of over 60 researchers and 120 advisors who have modeled, measured, and mapped 100 different solutions to global warming in order to show that it's actually possible by 2050 to reverse global warming. And these are a huge variety of solutions. They're from 7 different sectors, including buildings and cities, electricity generation, food, land, materials, transport, and women and girls. And this is the first time that these have been combined in such a comprehensive way. It was released in a book that came out in April of 2017 and has had huge success. It was number 9 on the New York Times bestsellers list in its first week, and is inspiring lots of people to tackle these solutions all over the world.
Okay, well, one thing that kind of resonates with me is we often hear about curbing like global warming, but like reverting the effect, we don't hear a lot about it. Could you explain a little bit the thinking that goes behind that approach?
Yeah, that's the biggest thing that Project Drawdown has done differently. The Ipcc goals are all to stop global warming at 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to today. What Drawdown actually says is that we can reach a point where we have a peak in greenhouse gas emissions and then reverse them year over year. And that's what Drawdown means. And so with a lot of effort from government, businesses, and all of society across the world, Drawdown shows that using the 80 solutions that it mapped that we can actually hit this point.
Okay, so we can relate a little bit to the solutions. What would be a practical example of one of those solutions?
So actually, one of the most interesting solutions was educating women and girls. With a combination of educating women and girls and family planning, those are the number 5 and number 6 ranked solutions for reversing global warming. There's also the typical things that you see, like wind turbines, solar panels on the energy side, and land use things that actually draw carbon out of the atmosphere.
Excellent. Now I'd like to ask a question to Bill regarding that project and how this approach to systems level change resonates with him and his activities.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks. So I think exactly what Erika just laid out, I see a lot of parallels with what is occurring in the investment world. So TIP basically grew out of a frustration. Myself and my co-founder both are deep in the kind of impact investment and sustainable finance world. And one of the big kind of questions that we found ourselves grappling with about a little over 2 years ago was just this idea that a lot of the underlying investments associated with these concepts of ESG integration or sustainable investing, impact investing, pick your flavor, that they were still predicated in large part on these kind of linear production and consumption models. So that in reality, when you're thinking about making investments that potentially generate positive outcomes for society, that they're not necessarily going as far. They're essentially Band-Aids, as opposed to helping to actually solve problems and heal the wound. So we started out with that basic premise or that idea kind of festering in our heads a couple years ago, which is to say that it's obvious that collective portfolio decision-making by investors has an impact and influence on the health of overarching societal, environmental, financial systems on which all of kind of investors rely on for wealth generation. And so that was the basic principle behind TIP, was that investors can engage in investing in a way that generates positive outcomes for overarching systems. So that was the what. We then set out to answer how does an investor begin to identify a system that's relevant for consideration within their investment decision-making? Which actually kind of interestingly dovetails a little bit with what Erika's talked about with Project Drawdown. We essentially came up with 4 criteria for how an investor does that. So consensus, so is this a widely debated or studied issue? Is it relevant to long-term financial performance across asset classes? Effectiveness, so could the issue be substantially impacted or influenced by investors? And then there's just the uncertainty question. If unaddressed, could this lead to systemic disruptions that are difficult to predict or quantify? So Project Drawdown really helps kind of answer, I think, the consensus criteria. And so at any rate, we then kind of came up with this framework for how an investor might begin to think about systems level considerations in their decision making. Then we answered the third question, which we always got, which was, okay, but who's doing what? Is this just an idea that's filtering around me and my partner's heads, or are actual investors engaging in this way? And so we essentially set out over the course of a year to scan 50 investors. It was tilted more towards asset owners than asset managers, and it included a range of pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, diversified financial institutions, responsible investment described firms. At any rate, what we were able to surface was that investors are pursuing systems level thinking in their investments, and they're primarily doing that on a number of on-ramps to get to systems thinking. So if you see or hear words like impact investment or universal ownership or long-term value creation, that these all are kind of early indicators that an investor might be considering systems level factors. Once an investor goes on one of these on-ramps, when they're on the kind of systems level highway, that there are essentially 10 tools of intentionality or strategies that they ultimately end up pursuing. So we see this kind of manifest in PGGM. PGGM, very involved with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation with the CE 100. They have something called a solutions-focused fund, where they're essentially allocating 20 billion euro for actual financing of solutions to major systemic issues, so water or climate change or food. you have institutions like the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund, which invest to create additionality within the Irish economy. So they are seeking to not displace any industry or investment, and they're also seeking not to create redundancy. And then you have a group like a pension fund like CDPQ in Canada that is looking at only investing so that it creates positive benefits to Quebec. So they have a particular local or what we call locality type focus. And the kind of last big key finding that we have found is that the way that investors are pursuing these kinds of opportunities is that they're going through fundamental investment activities. So this isn't like a bolt-on CSR lightweight type thing. This is the actions and the strategies that they're pursuing are fundamental to their investment discipline, and they're manifesting in ways like investment belief statements, where an investor is actually using that to give to an asset manager to guide how they actually build their investment portfolios, that there is this kind of mission criteria. So I want to see circular economy activities better embedded in our investment practice, and so an investment manager has to follow that. We see it in portfolio construction and security selection processes. So the actual building of portfolios, they're looking for these kinds of opportunities. So to answer your question, which will be the second thing that you probably say to me is, all right, Bill, give me another example. So take something like a water fund. That's a really popular kind of thematic lens to put on investment funds generally. The difference between a regular water fund versus a systems level water fund would be something as simple as a regular water fund is going to look to derive revenue off the privatization of water resources around the world in a world that is increasingly dealing with water scarcity issues. Now, a systems level water fund is going to actually it's going to be built on opportunities that are actually seeking to solve water scarcity issues and or enable access to water by folks that haven't had access to it. So it's actually looking to change the paradigm in a way that a typical impact or responsible type related investment might not. And so it's things like that these things are manifesting through these key investment activities, and that it's now kind of opened up, and we're now at over, I think, 100 investors in our database of investors that we look at that are engaging in this way. And it's the biggest investors in the world, all the way down to really interesting boutique firms like Circularity Capital, which is what Jamie Butterworth is now head of, or something like Closed Loop Funds here in the U.S. Anyway, we're seeing a lot of this experimentation, and we're seeing it really be embraced in the investment world as a driver of long-term stable returns, as much as Erika is experiencing it with a kind of source of innovation for corporations. So I'll pause there.
Okay, so your approach was basically to shift from solutions that were looking at the symptoms to actually look more at the causes of what makes the current, what you call the linear system, our economy, where we take, make, and dispose stuff, to actually look at what the causes of the problems that we experience, which you link to that economic system, and find a new alternative, which is a circular economy, as you mentioned it. And then how did you drag investors in? Because I would guess that you need to show a return potential, I guess, to bring a number of investors in. How did you achieve that?
Yeah, really good question, and it's a very important question. So two factors have really contributed, I think, to getting investor involvement. One is there has been a kind of major breakthrough over the last 10 years around how we account for these dimensions, so these environmental, social, and governance dimensions, as real material drivers of financial performance. So these are not, yet again, I can't say this enough, these are not bolt-on, flimsy type assessments that are meant to appeal to like hearts and minds. This is really something that is built into the investment discipline. There's a group called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board here in the U.S., kind of our equivalent of GRI for Europeans. But what they've done is essentially map the 79 industries that compose the U.S. economy and have essentially gone through and looked at what the kind of key performance indicators related to environmental, societal, and governance factors are within each of these industries, demonstrating their actual material performance or material value on financial performance. That's been huge, and it's echoed a lot of other efforts around the industry that have really tried to make the case and do it in a very compelling and quantifiable way that these factors do have a influence on financial performance. The other thing, I guess, which we would be, it would be a huge omission if we didn't point it out, a lot of major institutional investors, much like major corporations, have really been galvanized by the whole United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which for anyone watching, SDGs, it's kind of the global blueprint for poverty alleviation and environmental stability that is going to be guiding a lot of effort over the next, say, 15 years or so. I guess maybe 13 years now. It's been 2 years in. But the thing about that, it's captured. I mean, it's very, it was a consensus type way and consultative process where they got to these 17 issues that everyone should be focusing on. And they did it in a way that was different from the Millennium Development Goals, in a way that there are now more goals to shoot for. The metrics people are looking for is actual solving of these issues, not percentages of change like the MDGs. And at any rate, they've resonated more with investors. And so at the same time the TIP was ramping up, the SDGs were getting announced. And so a lot of investors right now are struggling because they're saying, okay, I want to align with the SDGs. I want to align with these greater global goals, but they don't know how to necessarily develop programs and practices around that, and they certainly don't know how to build products that target specific ones, let alone the questions of measurement and reporting on these activities. And that's really where TIP has come in. We've filled this market need where to say, okay, if you want to go in this direction, we'll help you go beyond alignment so you can actually do action towards these issues. So we've been lucky. I mean, I think it's as part identifying a need. People were asking, well, what does this all roll up to? At the same time, this kind of global audience has embraced the SDGs. So
basically, it's the role of global ambition that are the SDGs and finding the right KPI to measure your impact and investment.
Absolutely.
What I'd like is to get Erika's perspective on that channeling of investment towards systems level change and more sustainable practices. But before getting your perspective, Erika, how you see that funding transform on the ground, I'm going to turn back to Emily, who is going to give us more information about what's coming up next in the DIF.
Thank you, Francois. I'm just going to take a few moments out of this session to tell you about some other fantastic live studio sessions that we have coming up this week. Firstly, what if every single act of design and construction improved the current state of the world? A big question, one that is asked by those who take up the Living Building Challenge. Join us after this session at 5 p.m. today to find out more about this, how the Design Challenge operates and how it can be improved and how we can improve the world. Tomorrow we have Kate Rayworth joining us in the studio. Kate is going to talk to us about how to think like a 21st century economist. She is the acclaimed author of the book Donut Economics, and she's going to tell us about all we need to know about addressing the 21st century challenges, a key DIF 2017 theme. Don't miss out on this fantastic opportunity to grill Kate with all your questions and comments. Finally, the Circular Design Challenge kicked off last week, in a live studio session. The circular design case provides us with the opportunity to redesign everything through the circular economy. Don't forget to tune in this week for another session where we can have a live Q&A. It won't be in the studio this time, but you can still tune in and ask any questions and comments that you have. It's a fantastic way to fine-tune your projects if you want to get involved in the challenge. Before I hand back to Francois, I just want to remind you that this is an interactive festival. We really love hearing your comments and questions, so please do keep sending them in. A really easy way to do this is to get yourself onto Twitter and use the hashtag ThinkDiff. Now back to Francois.
Thank you very much, Emily. So much things happening in those weeks of DIF. So we were discussing with Erika Boeing and Bill Burkhart about financing system level change, and Bill was telling us about how the mindset of investors have changed in the recent years, especially since the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, have been agreed on an international level. And telling us about how investors are acting now to make that happen. And I'd like to get Erika's perspective on how she sees that translate into action.
Yeah, everything Bill said resonated quite a bit. I think starting with Drawdown, I know they've been approached quite a bit by philanthropists and investors who are interested in figuring out how can we translate the work of Drawdown and apply it to their investment decisions. And while it's kind of at an early stage right now, they're looking at putting together a Drawdown funding network of investors and philanthropists that can work together and figure out a lot of the questions that are very similar to what Bill was talking about, but applied to Drawdown. And it's early stage right now, so it's not quite clear exactly what that's going to look like. But they're assembling an initial brain trust of experienced investors and philanthropists to figure out what that kind of collaborative, open source, transparent platform that uses the principles established by Drawdown would look like. And more on the startup hardware funding side, I've seen some indications of what Bill was talking about, in particular a number of nonprofits that have been really supportive in helping get startups off the ground, and impact investors as well. Kind of in the early stages of exploring that, hardware funding and clean tech funding is at kind of there was a lot of investment in it in the past, and then it kind of hit a plateau as software became more popular. So I'd be interested actually to hear from Bill about how some of the investments and the look at this SDGs would affect that. If there's any hardware technologies are a lot of the solutions that we need to move sustainable solutions forward. So if some of the kind of new developments would affect that at all.
What would be your perspective, Bill, on that question?
Yeah, so part of the challenge, so a lot of what Erika and Project Drawdown in particular is focusing on, they have qualities that are very similar to the kind of overarching circular economy movement, at least how Ellen MacArthur Foundation defines it. And so part of the work that we've done is to try to help investors understand that that circular economy is a lens, not an asset class. And so I think in particular, the kinds of opportunities that Drawdown looked at and that Eric is talking about are potentially more early stage, and that they require a particular type or combination of capital in a way that is one particular need that needs to get solved for. So if you are an early stage opportunity, you're probably out there looking for venture capital. You're looking for that kind of patient capital that comes with a particular kind of skill set that can help you scale up. Whereas a lot of the institutional investors that we typically work for are looking at mobilizing an interest in this area as more of a lens than an asset class. So they're looking for total portfolio mobilization. They're looking at public equities. And so they're looking at publicly traded companies on the stock exchange that they can own and that they can influence. And so you have examples of things like As You Sow, which is like a shareholder advocacy group, influencing Dr. Pepper Snapple Group to embed or adopt a kind of comprehensive post-consumer packaging and recycling program, very circular economy-esque. You see opportunities in private equities where you see various kind of wealth management firms that are launching kind of circular economy aligned opportunities that are focused on renewable energy, recycling, material handling, energy savings. But you're also seeing fixed income, so bonds type things where cities are looking to finance kind of refurbishment or kind of reuse of water utilities and energy utilities, all the way down the spectrum to real assets and real estate and venture capital. And so I think for the particular kinds of opportunities that Eric is talking about, I think one of the challenges that they are encountering in terms of accessing this kind of capital is that a lot of these investment opportunities, whether they're in public equities or whether they're in private equities or venture capital, that they don't necessarily look, smell, and taste like a typical investment for an investor, regardless of which asset class they fall in. And so I think the real opportunity for a lot of these opportunities, redundant, is that they begin to, I think the ESG impact investment world provides a kind of bridge to get into these bigger pools of capital. So it's a question of, are these opportunities being measured? Are they being assessed, and are they being valued in the way that a lot of these investors are currently doing it? So are these opportunities aligned with IRIS metrics? Are they using gears? Are they using some of these standards that a lot of these types of investors are relying on to assess these types of enterprises? Are they showing up in particular databases like Impact Base or Impact Assets 50, where a lot of these investors are looking, such as investors that are willing to deploy different types of capital to meet different kinds of growth needs? And so those are those kinds of things where I don't think what Erika is describing with a focus on hardware, or if it's in a particular thematic area, I don't see these as being so far afield from where investors currently are. The problem is that a lot of the ways that these opportunities are being featured and presented to investors just are simply not close enough to where investors currently are. So there's a real opportunity to try to bridge that divide and potentially unlock more capital.
Okay, so how you said that those type of opportunities smell and taste differently from more normal opportunities, and that there's a need to bridge that gap. What would be your recommendations to bridge that gap?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, so it's simple as if you're an enterprise right now, a really great way to get on the radar of impact investors, and by impact investors, I'm drawing a big loop around that, and I'm also suggesting that because we're talking about this is going from the idea stage, we're looking for investors that are willing to provide more kind of either subsidized funding in the form of grants to kind of build up certain kinds of opportunities, and or are willing to take a more patient long-term time horizon to build up these opportunities. So the opportunity for these enterprises, these are probably going to be mostly private equity or kind of smaller financing type plays. And in that case, you're really going to want to start with, are you a for-benefit corporation? For-benefit corporation, that certification is a great way to get on the radar of impact investors in a way that impact investors understand it. Similarly, the way that a for-benefit corporation is certified, those features are aligned with gears, so it's a kind of the impact investing reporting standards, as well as those have been aligned with IRIS, which are the impact reporting and investment standards that a lot of investors rely on. So there's a kind of closed loop of linkages between those types of assessment and certification systems that would start to help at least bring these opportunities more into focus for investors. Whether or not in capital starts moving immediately into that direction is another question, but the idea being that at least you can start to show up on the platforms that investors are looking to for both assessing these types of opportunities, but also just identifying them. That would be a huge kind of early stage win that I don't think, I mean, for-benefit certification is somewhat of a complicated endeavor, depending on the size of an operation, but it's worth it, and it's a great way for companies to start moving in this direction in a fairly seamless way. Okay,
so basically aligning more closely the way entrepreneurs position themselves and talk about their endeavor and the metrics they use with what is used in the investing community.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think, I mean, the question that Erika had raised, so even if these investors do this, will it necessarily get on the radar of investors that are looking to invest in the SDGs? And I think one of the big challenges that a lot of investors are trying to figure out is, okay, how does, it's one thing to be able to say when you're investing in public equities or fixed income securities, which are very big in nature, it's one thing to be able to start to claim not just alignment with the SDGs, but your kind of portion of contribution towards them. It's harder to do that at some of these smaller scale levels, but even there, progress is kind of accelerating so quickly, and people are trying to better understand how a big innovative play and some kind of interesting startup could potentially disrupt an overall system, and that in and of itself has an influence, not an impact, and thinking about how they might capture that. So my point being is just that it's all moving very quickly, and I think that the more that investors can, definitely make that connection, they'll start to be able to be part of that kind of conversation in a way that they currently aren't.
Okay, so what you said ties nicely with the question we have from Kevin on ThinkDiff, who asks, when do you see these investment in social and environmental good become mainstream rather than a niche?
Well, so this is that mainstream gets thrown around quite a bit, and everybody wants to go. What is the line? Everyone wants to take the impact investment world from the margins to the mainstream. That's an interesting question in the sense that, right now, I think it's starting to happen. It's not just like groups like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation or the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. It's not just a lot of these self-selected responsible or impact networks or industry groups that are beginning to embrace this. We also now see the CFA Institute, the kind of major credentialing body for financial professionals around the world, are embracing ESG integration and impact investment as a core feature of a good fundamental investment discipline. We're seeing the Money Management Institute, the kind of major industry body for active investors here in the U.S., has now launched a sustainable investing education program to train financial advisors around the world. We're seeing indicators that this is, depending on how you define the mainstream, that it's going beyond just bespoke investment activity, innovative activity like a PGGM or someone else, to really get embraced by the overarching kind of ecosystem that these investors and investments play in. So I think it's starting to happen. How that gets reflected in any individual portfolio or in any individual industry or sector it varies. But the fact that we now have, so take an instance like what SASB, I mentioned them earlier, these accounting standards, the way that these KPIs have been captured is so that publicly held companies, particularly in the U.S., can actually report on these material, environmental, societal, and governance factors on their 10K, which is what public companies report on. That's huge. It's still voluntary, but the idea being that anything that's material to financial performance for a publicly held company has to get reported, and we've now figured out the mechanism to do that, at least in the U.S. That's mainstream. There's no other way to describe it. So I guess the message I would say to Kevin is the industry is catching up, and the ecosystem is now enabling this kind of activity for corporations and investors at exactly the same time that all of these trends, the same trends that are affecting this kind of interest in the circular economy, that all of these trends, millennial interest, women interest on boards, just general realities around commodities and other kinds of mega trends are kind of front and center on the investor mind as something they can no longer ignore and that they need to embrace and adopt to remain viable long term.
Well, thank you for that answer. So it's kind of in the mainstreaming process, if we want to summarize the thing. It's good that you brought up those trends because, as you highlighted, there are trends that are like what's bringing the circular economy to have more of an interest in at the moment, but also those trends were highlighted in the different work that Project Drawdown carried. And I have a question for Erika coming from Rachel on what was the reaction to Project Drawdown? You told us that the book was a New York Times bestseller, but broader than that, how was that approach received?
I think there's been quite a positive reaction to it. I haven't been involved with all of the reactions, but I know even in my community, I've met people who've brought it up to me without knowing that I was involved at all. There's someone starting an eco-village in St. Louis, Missouri, where I spend a lot of my time right now. And he, on his own, wrote a 100-page summary of how all the principles of drawdown could be used in their eco-village, and they had a whole day conference on it. And that was just one person that I happened to run into, and so it isn't even a representative sample. So as far as I can tell, there's been quite a positive reaction to it. I think there's been some work with trying to get it adopted by languages of several countries in their sustainability plans, and I think it really has a good shot of changing the way that people think about things. Instead of stopping climate change at 2 degrees warming, actually reversing global warming.
Okay, and in one of our previous conversations, you were mentioning also the work Project Drawdown is carrying at the moment to actually make those recommendations happen. Could you tell us more about how it is happening?
I think the future plans, first of all, the modeling that's been done on the solutions is going to be posted online and be an open source model that people can view and analyze on their own over time, and it'll be updated over time. And Project Drawdown released this book in April of 2017, but that's not the end of their work. The plan is to continue to update the models over time, track how the world is doing on each of the solutions, and track our progress towards reversing global warming. There's also plans to translate the solutions, which are now all modeled on a global level, to more national and regional levels, so that different countries and regions can tailor them to their specific needs. And that's all work that's very active right now, and that you should see in the near future.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much both. I've really enjoyed this conversation and the insights we got into applied systems thinking. But we have to bring it to a close now. Thank you very much, Erika and Bill, for joining us today. If you want to learn more about today's guest, then have a look at the page of their biographies. You can also use this session to find other related sessions that are going to happen in the DIF. And remember, the DIF is an online festival that gives a platform to hundreds of ideas, so you'll absolutely find something you love on thinkdiff.co. And please join the conversation using Twitter, #ThinkDiff. See you next time.